Natalia, thank you so much for joining us today at Timeless Teachings.
Thank you for having me. I'm so pleased to be here.
I'm looking at you and I see a gorgeous, glowing, very happy woman. And it's very interesting because the topic for today is trauma. And I feel that you're such a wonderful example of someone who have had a direct experience with that. And so you lived through this yourself. And also professionally, you worked with people helping them to deal with that. And you walk the talk, right? So, I mean, when I look at you, you look to me just a very content, very joyful, very fulfilled person and a woman. And I think this is what we want to see at the end of the result when we work with traumas. So maybe let's just dive into the subject. And I also want to give a very short warning to our audience. So every time when we do talk about trauma, if you are going through something really traumatic right now, so it could trigger you, because then it would maybe sort of ask you to look deeper at things. And if it is you right now, then I'm just asking, please be gentle with yourself, take it step by step, ask for support and for help. And at any time of our conversation today, if Natalia or myself are sharing something that you feel maybe is too much for you to hear at the moment, it's okay to pause and come back later. Right? So with this kind of journey of healing, we always want to make sure that we are ready, that we are strong enough, and that we are fully supported. And so with that, I just would like you, Natalia, to share with us a little bit about your story.
What a beautiful trauma-informed introduction. Thank you for setting the safe space for this conversation and the listeners. My journey has been a complex, non-linear, messy one, and it continues. I believe I will always be healing. So even though you've reflected back to me where I am, which is in a really good embodied place, I do believe that healing is a lifelong, endless journey. I grew up within a lot of trauma. I've lived through many difficult things, and the trauma that I experienced then went on to decontextualize through my mind, my body, and my relationships. At age 17, I experienced mental health misdiagnosis, but actually, what was happening for me was I was having a reaction to living within really abusive dynamics. And at age 24, my trauma started to speak through my body. It started as whispers and it became screams. And I became very unwell. And the doctors didn't know what was going on. And so they continued to medicate me and try many different things. And so for about 17 years, I was lost in the medical system, first in the framework of a mental health condition, and then under the framework of a non diagnostic physical health condition. And there were periods where I didn't have use of my legs, I was not able to use my hands. It really was manifesting through every system in my body. And I was told that if the illness didn't kill me, that the medication and the treatments that I were on would kill me. And so to be told that as a young woman in my early 20s was pretty devastating. And I've always had a really strong spirit. So I always tried to make the best of it and find ways to cope and live as happy a life as I could within the context of what was my current reality. But when I looked through the lens of trauma, I started to make sense. And when I started exploring somatics and the story of my body, I was finally able to come home to myself and begin the process of healing. And then when I looked through the lens of relationship dynamics and systems, everything made sense on a deeper level. And I was able to unearth the systems and the dynamics that were perpetuating my pain. So it's been a really long journey. And after sort of many layers of healing, I ended up studying and working in the field. And now my focus is on speaking and writing and creating content and experience that empower as many of us as possible to heal.
Thank you for sharing. It's so beautiful and so honest and so deep. And I think that we can all relate to trauma to some extent. We all had it, or maybe still having it. It's just part of the human existence and our experience. And I don't think there is a single human being in the past, present, or future who was able to live through entire life without ever going through trauma. I don't even think it's possible. So it is something, it's inevitably part of our existence and our experience. And it is how we deal with that and how we process it what actually determines the quality of our life and the direction of our life. But you are a wonderful example who is healed enough to actually holding space for others and doing your beautiful work. And, I can also remember myself, like you shared a little bit about your upbringing. And I think I'm also one of those people who just went through a very difficult time, especially in my childhood and forming years. There were all kind of abusive and traumatic things were happening. And it took me, I think on average, it was maybe about 12 years of like really deep work, leaving no stone unturned, traveling around the world, studying with whoever promised any kind of liberation and ease of pain, right? And then eventually I find, yes, if we put in the work like you did, then we all arrive in this space where life finally seems to be happening for us and not to us.
I think when we do enough healing work, we move into a space where we can access agency and choice. And the moment we can access agency and choice, we're no longer at the mercy of our trauma or the world around us. We become creators. But the difficult thing is when we have trauma coursing through our nervous system and shaping our psyche, we fundamentally are experiencing this deep sense of disempowerment. So if somebody comes along and says, just choose it, just choose your healing, just change your life, it feels impossible. And it can actually also be received as re traumatizing because it can feel like, well, no one really understands. I can't, I want it, but I can't. And so I can't is the direct kind of organizing principle that goes with this sense of powerlessness that is synonymous with trauma. And as we learn to show up as people that support others through their healing, we can understand this, and that every time we offer agency and choice within a dynamic or relationship, we are providing an invitation to heal and to that emancipation.
And this is beautiful description. And how about we give a definition of trauma so to make sure that we all understand what are we talking here about?
Trauma is when a past experience of threat that's over is living and breathing in us now, and it can affect us physiologically, mentally, emotionally, and relationally or dynamically. It's largely unconscious, non-verbal, and it's felt. So it's somatic in nature, and it speaks through sensations, emotions, and relating patterns, and it travels through relationships, communities, and cultures. I think it's also important to understand trauma is not the past event itself. It's how it's left unmetabolized inside us and how it alters the way we perceive, express, and relate. So people could go through the same experience but have different levels of trauma or potentially no trauma at all.
It's a very interesting observation. And, it brings to my memory even example from my own family. Like I have a brother who is 10 years older than myself. And even trauma like your parents separating, which many children go these days. And it's like one of those early that many experience. And this was very interesting. So here we are coming from the same family, two siblings, going through exactly the same life scenario and having an entirely different response to it that pretty much until now determined the course of our life. Where I guess in my case, it just maybe how I was very young at the time, but maybe just how my mind was wired. I use this as a fuel to figure out what's happening and how can I master this? What can I do about it? And my brother went in the entire opposite direction, blaming, complaining. It's always someone else's fault. And that impacted, just as you said, not only him and his physiology, but also relationships with people around him. And now he's in his third marriage. So it's amazing how it actually has less to do with what is happening or has happened, but more how we react or respond to it.
Absolutely. And our ability to process and metabolize and integrate trauma is very complex and unique, but it's all about resources. So we can consider our physical health and mental health baseline at the time of the trauma and shortly after the trauma. But the most important thing that we need to consider is the quality of our relationships. So when we are able to move through difficult experiences or be met after difficult experiences with kind, caring, compassionate people, we'll be more likely able to metabolize them because we share capacity for the healing. Whereas if we go through difficult experiences and don't have anybody there to be with us, to hear us, and to validate and share that capacity, we're more likely to end up with more severe unresolved complex trauma. So the relationship piece is key.
Through all this journey that you went in your own healing, what were some of the biggest realizations for yourself?
For me, the biggest initial realization was that in the context of trauma, I make sense. So I was always wondering from a very young age, why am I like this? What's wrong with me? Why do I feel like something's different or not as it should? Why am I not like everybody else? So I was cloaked in shame for most of my life, wondering what is wrong. But once I started to understand myself in the context of trauma, and I made more sense. I could let go of shame, which was one of the biggest things that was blocking me from moving forward with my healing and learning to love myself and also allowing others to love me well. Another really big piece for me was around understanding and healing my nervous system.
And there is a common belief in a society that when we talk about trauma, then often people say, well, first of all, it's largely for women, maybe for younger women even, and, definitely not for men. So, guys are strong and trauma. What kind of trauma? You have trauma. I don't have any trauma. So there is very interesting reality how unresolved traumas in all kinds of people, including men, showing up, for example, at work. And when we have leaders who have never done any work because maybe perceived to be too soft and too vulnerable and too threatening, and some cultures are more open, some less open to this kind of work, also culturally. But then, so we end up having people who never actually looked at that. And just as you said, it impacts everything. It impacts how they run their businesses. It impacts how they run countries. It impacts what's happening within the families. And I know that you have done a lot of work with people in different positions in social service. You are working with companies also currently. So could you just share with us what are your observations about that and what it is that we can all do to help each other to heal that in a safe way?
When a person in a position of power, so a leader or an authority figure, is holding unresolved trauma, it will decontextualize into the dynamics of the family, the community, or the system that they are leading. And so when someone in this position hasn't done their healing work, they continue to recreate these cycles of oppression and bias and exclusion and inequity that we are trying so hard to remedy. And so what I see in the corporate landscape at the moment is there's a lot of very good intentions, but because a lot of them aren't focusing on the healing and integration and embodiment of leadership, they often don't integrate, or they might work for a short time like a band-aid, but then the wound keeps weeping and there's some other manifestation of the trauma. And the longer this happens, the more diffuse and complicated it begins to get. And so this is a very big thing I see when it comes to DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and mental health initiatives in organizations. And I think if we really want to create systemic change, we need to come back to doing our own healing work. So heal your trauma, change the world. When leaders have reached a certain level of their own internal peace to be able to own and master their power, they're going to show up in ways where they can distribute power and where they can create equity and harmony through their own embodied example. And it's been interesting stepping into this space in recent years. The organizations that I do work with all already have leadership that really want to commit to this journey. It's at least a 2-year process, and you're going to need to get vulnerable and be part of the process. And so the organizations I work with, they're all in. But there's a lot of organizations who aren't really up for that. And usually it comes down to not wanting to invest the resources, whether that be time or money. And so when we look at traditional business models, it's important for us to get really real and honest about it. Business is about money, it's about profit, and that's never going to change, and nor should it. But if we want to bring systemic change and healing through an organization, we need to reimagine what a business model looks like and include different markers for success. And when we heal, we move towards a state of sustainability. So there's not going to be any more, let's create a unicorn and let's increase our profit by 400%. It's going to be about, well, let's find slow, sustainable growth. And so if we really want to put our money where our mouth is when it comes to organizational culture, we're going to have to adopt that philosophy for business.
It is such a wonderful future that we can create if we only all do that. How and what is the best way to maybe at least start looking at traumas for people who are listening to it right now and they go, well, I feel there is something for me to look at. And so where do I begin?
Beautiful way to begin is to explore our experience of safety versus threat, and also our experience of self-care versus self-abandonment. So these are really two common threads for continued inquiry as we heal. So when we are feeling anxious or fearful or distressed, we can learn to check in with our nervous system and ask, am I experiencing safety or threat right now? And in these instances, it will most likely be a sense of threat. The next question that we can ask ourselves is this threat needed right here now in the present? And if someone is actually threatening us, then yes, it is. But in the case of trauma, we're often experiencing the past threat in the present. So the threat response may not be needed right now. And once we realize that, our nervous system will automatically start to come out of a threat response. And when that happens, we can engage with a lot more conscious intention. So that's number one, to unlink the past and the present by questioning or inquiring as to whether our sense of threat is needed right now. When it comes to self-abandonment versus self-care, I believe self-abandonment is the disease of our generation. We have learnt to be people pleasers and overworkers and benevolent givers, and we do it at our own detriment. Then we're burnt out, we're cranky, we're triggered, we're sick, and all of these things are because we don't have good boundaries. And we don't have good boundaries because somewhere along the line there's been messaging, whether it's through family, culture, community, or social media, that says your boundaries are bad and you're a better person if you don't have any. And so we can start to ask ourselves, is what I'm doing now an act of self-care or self-abandonment? And we can begin to ask ourselves, well, what would nourish me now? Most of us don't ask that.
What would nourish me now? I love this question. I remember how during my healing of those 12 years that I shared with you, one of those most impactful questions that actually at the time it was a therapist I was working with that she asked me was, do you know what is nourishing your soul? So to me, that kind of what hit home at that time. And at the same time, now when I'm listening to you, I feel that when we talk about nourishment, it's like what nourishes the body, what nourishes the mind, right? So all of those things. And it is so important to focus on that. And still, like in our society, I'm not saying it is true for absolutely every family everywhere, But statistically, it is still largely true that women tend to be the glue in a society and the force that either kind of unites or destroys everything within the family, one way or another. And that's why the conversation around healthy boundaries and self-nourishment is just so important, because so many others depend on our well-being.
Most of us have been taught that we don't deserve our boundaries. Most of us don't even know what boundaries are. So we walk around depleting ourselves or allowing others to take from us. And we might feel both shame and fear around our boundaries. So if we've been taught that boundaries are bad or wrong, we'll feel shame the moment we even consider to put one in. And if we have a past where there's been some kind of punishment or harm when we've tried to assert our boundaries, we might feel very fearful when we start to put them in. So the boundaries piece when it comes to healing is huge, and it will ask us to continue to meet our fear and shame again and again and prove to ourselves that our boundaries are welcome, and learn that if there is anybody in our lives that's not welcoming our boundaries, that we need to say goodbye to them.
And it happens very often. And the interesting part, which is a very tricky conversation, because those people could also end up being family members and like parents very often, or could be siblings, or like anyone else who is like in our close environment. And, you know, when I work with people, I usually say that, well, if it is someone in your family that you can't just close the door entirely, you can buy some time off until you learn within yourself how to establish your boundaries and how to maintain it, right? So you don't have to exclude person entirely from your life, but you're probably not going to learn anything about your boundaries if someone constantly will be breaching, and you will not have the space to figure out what it is actually. Just even recently, I spoke with another therapist, actually happened to be, who specializes working with moms or women who are considering conception and pregnancy and just becoming a mom. And this, of course, this is like a huge conversation about boundaries. And so, and that it's not all on you. There are also other people who actually can and should support. We don't put child in a position where they have to live their life for us, or when we force them so we can live life through them, right? So we want a child to live life with us. So we're inviting them into our life. And therefore, it's so important that especially things like traumas needs to be healed. Otherwise, it becomes a generational trauma. And I'm sure, like even through your work, probably when you look deeper, you saw patterns of your mom and your dad and maybe other people. We all carry that until one day someone stands up in the lineage and says, well, I'm going to heal it. And it's regardless whether people who are listening right now, whether you want to become a parent or not, it doesn't matter. You do it for yourself first, that you are the one who just refuses to suffer any longer.
I believe deeply that the task of our generation is to heal our trauma so that our children will not have to go through the level of searching and seeking and metabolizing that we have had to do. And so when I look at my two children, so my children are 8 and 10, I know that the work I've done has integrated because they are living completely different lives. They are safe, they are able to be authentic, they are able to speak up and set boundaries, they are able to be curious and play. I wasn't able to do any of those things. So I really see the proof that when we commit to our own healing, the next generation has an opportunity to use all of that freed up energy for good. We're paving the way here.
Absolutely. And look, even at the generation of our children already, I mean, they will have to deal with the climate change and AI in a big way that we probably want. And of course, if it wouldn't be possible for them to fully deal with that in the most kind of congruent and efficient way if we don't do our part. Because they're just the same way how our parents did the best they could and they created the life for us where we can look at our traumas. I mean, our mothers and fathers, it was not even an option for most people because the standard of living was much low and there was just much more dangers going on around, much more unrest in the world. And so there was no time or space for this, as you said. So our generation has time and space. So absolutely we should do that so that our children can start creating this, like the rise of a new society.
I think every generation has done their piece, and this is ours to heal.
Thank you so much, Natalie. And since we're speaking about children as the next generation, like if I were to ask you to share a message with your children and everyone else who are like them, so what would you say?
Simply, you are valid, you are worthy, and I love you. That is all we really need to know.
Thank you so much for joining us today. It was wonderful to have a conversation with you. And I wish you incredible success on your mission because you have a very powerful mission. And of course, for everyone who has been listening to Natalia today, and if you want to learn more, please read description. There will be all information there how you can connect with her. And at this platform, we are just creating space for those authentic conversations. So I would personally appreciate your support with subscribing, leaving a review, sharing with a friend. And I see you next time with another guest. Feel free to share this episode with friends, subscribe to the podcast and YouTube channel, and follow us on social media. And remember, you are the master of your own life.